And so sometimes he had a hard time making friends, and even some of his good friends had their relationship strained over the years. I remember Chuck Hagel, very, very close to John McCain. Then they had a strained relationship, and then they came back together again as friends. The same thing with Lindsey Graham and others in the Senate. And certainly that was the way it was with George W. Bush. But President George W. Bush has great respect for the work that John McCain did and the leadership he gave. And I know the whole Bush clan and the entire Bush political family really respects John McCain for what he did for this country as a naval aviator, as a prisoner of war, as someone who defended democracy and worked for democracy and served this country so well in the House and in the Senate. But more than that, being a real conscience for the tough things that have to be considered when you're in government. And he also had the courage to look for compromise. He was not a zero-sum game person. He would look for common ground and try to define it in such a way that you could find a way to stand on it with him. And that was important.
That was so important that he worked across the aisle with Teddy Kennedy, Joe Biden, and others. They could disagree on policy, but they could come together and try to legislate. And I'm also struck, as I bring in Robert Costa, national political reporter for the Washington Post, and of course moderator for Washington Week on PBS, I'm struck, Robert, by how important getting something done was. That was his last big speech on the Senate floor.
Worried about the GOP direction on taxes, though he was a traditional Republican at his core. On issues like immigration a decade ago in 2007, he worked so hard to try to get his party to move toward the center on immigration, on foreign policy. He was such a hawk, someone who valued international alliances. And in the last few years, you've seen him struggle. When I've been covering him in the Senate, reporters there, we've confided in each other about how McCain seems out of step with his own party, defiant as ever, stubborn, committed to his own causes. But his causes really drifted away from the Republican Party in a way that they were not drifting away under President Reagan and President Bush.
Robert Costa, moderator of Washington Week on PBS, and of course the Washington Post correspondent. Thank you. Michael Beschloss, NBC presidential historian, has known John McCain well and for long. And Michael, earlier you were pointing out how in September of 2008, before the Lehman crash, before that meeting in the Roosevelt Room where John McCain came and the White House was bringing in both Obama and McCain, and he didn't seem to have policies for the economic crisis. And that seemed to be when his campaign took a downturn, frankly. But you were pointing out that before the Lehman crash, at the beginning of September in 2008, he was ahead of Barack Obama in the polls.
That's exactly right, and that would have been a very close race. And I think John McCain later on said that his own reaction to the economic collapse of September of 2008 was not his finest hour. But in retrospect, I think you would probably agree, Andrea, that there were very few Republicans who could have won the presidency that year after the twin difficulties of one or two very unpopular wars, plus a very big economic collapse, plus a two-term Republican president. Very hard, as you know, for any president nominee in history to win the presidency for one party 3 terms in a row. But the thing about John McCain is that this is not someone who depended on being president to be a great figure of American history. And look at how much we're talking about tonight that has nothing to do with the presidency, but we're talking about John McCain with the same degree of intensity and interest that I think we would almost if he had been president himself.
And I'm also thinking about his role in trying to legislate and change the guidelines that the Bush White House were following through Vice President Cheney, President Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, regarding detainees. He was, because he had been a prisoner of war,
Absolutely.
Was passionate about passing that legislation against what he said was torture.
He never wanted to forget what he had been through. And although the preponderance of the Republican Party and the incumbent and vice president, just as you're saying, felt very strongly about those policies. And John McCain had made a big effort to try to get along with George W. Bush after that fierce fight that you talked about in the primaries of 2000. That really ended at things like torture and what he saw as an American attempt to use, he thought, some of the things that had been used against him as a POW in North Vietnam.
Thank you so much, Michael Beschloss. Joining us now is Nicole Wallace, host of Deadline White House, who was a senior advisor, of course, for John McCain's presidential campaign in 2008. Nicole, our condolences to you and all of the close advisors and aides who traveled with him, who fought for him, and who knew him so well and loved him so much.
Yeah, I mean, you and I started this conversation Friday, Andrea, at 4, when we were talking about his brave decision to end treatment. And so I think what you think about on days like this is even when you know it's coming, even when you've had, in his case, almost a year to grapple with the news that that he has this horrible diagnosis, there's nothing that really prepares you for a world without John McCain in it. And we talked on Friday about that, the clarity of his voice after the Helsinki summit, the clarity of his convictions about what America is when it's at her best, about what the Republican Party has been when it's been at its best, and about what the Senate is when it's at its best. And if you look at sort of his body of public statements in the year since his diagnosis, they really touch all those three touchstones. And you think about his speech where I believe Senator Biden or Vice President Biden introduced him, where he talked about this ideology of America first will end up in the ash heap of history. A strong, clear indictment of isolationism. You look at the written statement he released after Helsinki, and it was a strong and clear indictment of what he viewed as giving too much to Vladimir Putin, someone he views as a murderer and a thug. And you look at sort of the sadness with which he gave the first speech after the diagnosis about how the Senate should return to regular order, which probably doesn't mean very much to people who don't cover Washington or live in Washington, but those were institutions that meant the world to him, and after his family, probably the most to him. His country, our country's national security, the Republican Party, and sort of the prestige and power of the American presidency.
And when you speak about John McCain, the fact that he is receiving these tributes from all of the former presidents in both political parties, from senators, but also I have one here from Madeleine Albright, and it's not self-evident, but you know and I know that John McCain was responsible for the International Republican Institute, which he chaired, and she chaired the National Democratic Institute, traveling around the world, working together. This is one of the things that he legislated. He was very proud of it, and he was very active until his illness in it, chairing it. And she also, an octogenarian, traveling around the world as he did. I mean, he was never home during congressional recesses. He was always finding someone in the world. Mark Salter wrote about this in the Washington Post just now in something that he's posted, finding refugees, prisoners in Myanmar who said to him, we remember your voice. You called out our names, how much it meant to us, that you recited our names on Radio Free Europe or the Voice of America or one of those broadcasts.
Yeah, it's such an important piece of his legacy, and probably not one that gets enough attention. But I think the reason he was as comfortable with Democrats as with Republicans, and that is as true of a thing as you will hear uttered today. He was as comfortable with his Democratic colleagues in the Senate as he was, in a lot of cases, more comfortable with his Democratic colleagues. He had a deep love for Ted Kennedy, and I remember during that '08 campaign, Ted Kennedy calling him. Ted Kennedy, one of the earliest endorsers, and someone who really celebrated and boosted the candidacy of then Senator Obama, and that friendship survived all those things because it was built on something more than a single presidential election cycle, even one with John McCain in it. But I think that the reason policymakers that can help the lives of the kinds of people you just described.
And some of his closest colleagues in this generation were Jack Reed and Chris Coons on the Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committees. There is really poignantly a statement from Vicky Reggie Kennedy. Today is the 9th anniversary of Teddy Kennedy's death from glioblastoma, from the same brain cancer. And on this day, she writes, "We lost an uncompromising patriot and a man of immeasurable courage. Getting to know John McCain was one of the great privileges of my life. I know my late husband, Ted, felt the same way. Like Teddy, John McCain loved the United States Senate and believed in its power to impact lives in a positive way. Indeed, he declared from the floor of the U.S. Senate that the proudest and most satisfying moments of his career were when he worked with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to address our greatest challenges." So that brings home exactly what you were saying, Nicole Wallace. Thanks so much, Nicole.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. Thanks for doing this tonight.
And I know this is going to be a very difficult number of days. And Michael Beschloss, your thoughts as well?
Well, it's a day that we have known for some time would come, but the man was so absolutely full of life that it's almost impossible to imagine that it's here. And I think something we probably should talk about is that one way that he has spoken truth to power over the last year and a half is that he stood up to the incumbent president of the United States, Donald Trump. You were talking a little bit earlier, Andrea, about what John McCain said about President Trump's performance in Helsinki. This is a time that among Republican senators, there are not a lot of people who are going to have that role, so we're going to be living in a very different political world.
Indeed, we are. And in fact, one of his closest friends from all of his past campaigns, Lindsey Graham, has differed with John McCain in this period by maintaining that close relationship with the president. And that has probably caused some pain at various times during these many months. Let's bring in Chris Matthews, the host of Hardball. Chris, of course, on days like today, nights like tonight, we think of the greatness of this man. We've lost a great American patriot, a great public servant, a senator, a warrior, a politician, imperfect, he'd be the first to admit. And as I was just saying, on the 9th anniversary of Teddy Kennedy's death from the same terrible brain cancer.
Wow. Well, I said this earlier tonight, and I still think it's what the reason people love the gladiatorial aspect of politics, where it's really one against the other, and there's a real combat to it, and you look for guts, spiritual guts. You look for people that stick to what they believe and never be their own person. And John McCain was always his own person. I mean, he wasn't a knee-jerk lefty or a knee-jerk righty. He didn't fit the mold, which was there for so many of these other politicians to just sort of slip into. He was always John McCain, and he could be disconcerting. You could love him one day and he'd really mend him the next day because he wasn't there to make you like him. And that you would love him on McCain-Feingold on campaign reform, and you may not like him on being hawkish. But he was always John McCain. What I found him to be a character out of the movies, in the sense that if you were to write a romantic movie about American politics and the U.S. Senate especially, and you wanted to have heroes, people that really stood out and had guts, profiles and courage, if you will, he would be a perfect candidate in real life for that romantic role. He was the classic U.S. senator. If you ever want to grow up to be a senator, I think you'd want to grow up to be John McCain. You wouldn't grow up to be just one of the votes for either party. You'd want to be someone who everyone wondered about where they're going to go and how they're going to vote and what's their conscience going to lead them to. And I also like the fact that he was a statesman in the sense that even though he could be incredibly tough on his opponents and bitter at times, he really did stand up for his opponent, Barack Obama, in a couple of critical moments. One was when that woman in the crowd said that he was an Arab, and she meant that in the worst possible way of saying something. And McCain could have said, yeah, and just go along with that sort of slur. It was a slur to her. And instead he said, no, he's a decent man. We just have to disagree. And boy,